The morning came wrapped in mist, the kind that clings to everything like a confession you're not ready to make. I stood in our kitchen, watching through the window as the fog rolled across the pasture in slow, deliberate waves. The coffee in my cup had gone cold, but I held it anyway, needing something to do with my hands. Father appeared in the doorway, his suspenders already pulled tight over his shoulders, his beard catching the dim light from the oil lamp. He didn't look at me directly. He rarely did anymore. Not since I'd turned 20 and he'd begun to notice the way I lingered too long in prayer, the way I found excuses to avoid the Sunday evening singings where the young women gathered with their bright laughter and expectant eyes. "Samuel Miller needs a ride to town," he said, his voice carrying the weight of morning quiet. His father asked if we could spare the cart. I nodded, though something inside my chest tightened at the mention of Samuel's name. I'd seen him before, of course, at meetings, at barn raisings, standing always at the edge of groups with his hands folded behind his back. He was 3 years older than me, broad across the shoulders in a way that spoke of hard work and silent strength. His eyes were the color of deep water, and when he looked at you, which was rare, it felt like being seen through and found wanting. "I'll take him," I said, though Father hadn't asked if I would. It was understood. I was the youngest son, the one who could be spared from the morning milking, the one who had nowhere else to be. Father gave a short nod and walked away, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. I listened to him move through the house, gathering the small sounds of morning, the creak of the back door, the soft whinny of horses in the barn, the distant lowing of cattle waiting to be fed. All of it familiar, all of it mine, and yet somehow I felt like a stranger standing in the middle of it all. I finished my cold coffee and set the cup in the wash basin. Outside, the world was beginning to wake. The fog still hung thick over the fields, but I could see patches of grass emerging like islands, green and wet with dew. The sun was somewhere behind the mist, a pale suggestion of light that promised warmth but hadn't yet delivered it. I pulled on my coat and hat and stepped outside. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. Our horse, Ruth, stood waiting by the cart, her breath visible in small puffs of white. She turned her head toward me as I approached, her dark eyes calm and knowing. I ran my hand along her neck, feeling the warmth of her beneath my palm. "Good morning, girl," I murmured, and she snorted softly in response. The cart was already hitched and ready. Father had seen to that, as he saw to most things, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. I checked the harness once more, not because it needed checking, but because I needed something to do with the nervous energy that had settled in my stomach like a stone. Samuel Miller. I'd never spoken to him directly, not in all the years we'd attended the same meetings, lived in the same small district where everyone knew everyone else's business. We'd passed each other countless times, in the aisle between wooden benches during service, on the path between the house and the barn during communal meals, standing in line to wash our hands before prayer. But we'd never exchanged more than a nod, never shared more than a glance that lasted longer than politeness required. And yet somehow I knew things about him. I knew he was the middle son of Jonas Miller, that he worked his father's dairy farm with a quiet diligence that earned respect without demanding attention. I knew he sang in a low baritone during hymns, his voice blending seamlessly with the others but distinct enough that I could pick it out if I listened carefully. I knew he wore his hat pulled low over his eyes, and that when he removed it during prayer, his dark hair fell across his forehead in a way that made something shift uncomfortably in my chest. These were not things I should know about another man. These were not thoughts I should allow myself to have. But they came anyway, unbidden and unwelcome, in the quiet moments between prayers, in the space between sleep and waking, in the long silences that stretched across our dinner table when Father read from the Bible, and I tried to focus on the words instead of the way the lamplight caught the planes of his face. I heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned to see Samuel approaching through the mist. He walked with his head down, his hands clasped behind his back, his dark coat a shadow against the pale morning. As he drew closer, I could see that his face was serious, almost stern, his mouth set in a straight line that revealed nothing of what he might be thinking. Father appeared beside me, materializing from the fog like a figure from a dream. He nodded once at Samuel, then once at me, and without a word, he turned and walked back toward the house. The message was clear: handle this yourself, prove you can be trusted with simple responsibilities, show that you're growing into the man you are supposed to become. Samuel stopped beside the cart and looked up at me for the first time. His eyes were exactly as I remembered them, dark and still, like water at the bottom of a well. There was something in his gaze that I couldn't read, something that made my breath catch in my throat. "Morning," he said, his voice quiet and rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, though the word came out thinner than I'd intended. For a moment, we stood there in the growing light, the mist swirling around us like a curtain that might lift at any second to reveal truths we weren't ready to face. Then Samuel stepped up onto the cart, his movement fluid and sure, and settled himself on the wooden seat. I followed, climbing up beside him, and suddenly we were sitting shoulder to shoulder, our knees almost but not quite touching. I picked up the reins and made a soft clicking sound with my tongue. Ruth stepped forward, her hooves striking the gravel with a steady rhythm that seemed too loud in the morning quiet. The cart wheels began to turn, and we rolled away from my father's farm, away from the familiar comfort of home into the mist that swallowed the road ahead. The silence between us was not comfortable. It was heavy with unspoken words, thick with questions that couldn't be asked and answers that couldn't be given. I kept my eyes on the road, on Ruth's swaying haunches, on anything except the man sitting beside me whose presence seemed to fill all the empty spaces in my body with a strange aching awareness. We passed the Yoder farm where smoke was already rising from the chimney in a thin gray line. Then the Stoltzfus place where children's clothes hung on a line like colorful flags in the still air. The world was waking up around us, but inside our small circle of silence, time seemed suspended, held in place by the weight of everything we weren't saying. Samuel shifted beside me, adjusting his position on the hard wooden seat, and his thigh brushed against mine for just a moment. The contact sent a shock through my entire body, a jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with the cool morning air and everything to do with the warmth of another person's skin through layers of wool and cotton. I jerked away instinctively, pressing myself against the far side of the seat, and immediately felt foolish for my reaction. If Samuel noticed, he gave no sign. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on some point in the distance that only he could see. His profile was sharp against the pale sky, the straight line of his nose, the firm set of his jaw, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck where it disappeared beneath his collar. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the familiar rhythm of Ruth's gait, on the way the cartwheels found every rut and hollow in the dirt road. But my awareness of Samuel remained acute, like a fever that wouldn't break. I was conscious of every breath he took, every slight movement of his body, every moment when his eyes shifted to look at something new in the passing landscape. The fog began to lift as we traveled deeper into the countryside. It peeled away from the fields like a blanket being pulled back, revealing the green expanse of pastures where cattle stood like dark statues in the growing light. The sun climbed higher, burning through the mist to cast long shadows across the road ahead of us. We passed a grove of oak trees, their branches still bare from winter but showing the first hint of green buds that promised spring was truly coming. A red-winged blackbird perched on a fence post and called out as we rolled by, its voice sharp and clear in the morning air. Samuel turned his head to watch the bird, and I found myself watching him instead. The way the light caught the stubble along his jaw, the way his lips parted slightly as if he might speak but then closed again without making a sound. The road curved to follow the path of a small creek that ran parallel to our route. The water moved lazily between its banks, reflecting the sky like a ribbon of silver thread. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed, the sound carrying across the open fields like a prayer. I tried to think of something to say, some words that might break the silence without breaking whatever fragile thing was growing between us in the space where our knees almost touched. But every sentence that formed in my mind seemed too small or too large, too casual or too weighted with meaning I wasn't ready to acknowledge. Samuel reached for the reins suddenly, his hand extending toward mine. For a moment, our fingers were less than an inch apart, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Then he stopped, seeming to realize that I was already holding them, and let his hand fall back to his lap. "Sorry," he said quietly. "Thought you might want me to take a turn." His voice was deeper than I'd remembered, rougher around the edges in a way that made something low in my stomach clench with an emotion I couldn't name. I shook my head, not trusting my own voice to remain steady. "I'm fine," I managed, though the words came out barely above a whisper. He nodded and settled back against the seat. But something had changed in that moment of near contact. Some barrier had grown a little thinner. The silence that followed felt different, not empty, but full of possibility. We continued down the winding road, past farms and fields, past stands of trees where shadows still clung to the ground despite the climbing sun. The morning was fully awake now, bright and clear, with the promise of warmth that would burn off the last traces of mist and leave the world sharp and deafening. I found myself stealing glances at Samuel when I thought he wasn't looking. The way he held his shoulders, straight but not rigid. The way his hands rested on his thighs, long fingers relaxed against the dark fabric of his pants. The way he seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear, his head tilted slightly as if the world was whispering secrets meant only for him. There was something about his stillness that drew me, something about the way he seemed so completely present in each moment, while also being somewhere else entirely. He was like a deep pool of water, calm on the surface but hiding depths that couldn't be measured from above. The cart hit a particularly deep rut, jarring us both, and Samuel's hand shot out instinctively to steady himself. His palm landed on the wooden seat between us, his fingers spread wide, and for a heart-stopping moment, his pinky finger touched mine where it rested beside my leg. Neither of us moved, neither of us breathed. The contact was barely there, just the brush of skin against skin through the thin leather of our gloves, but it might as well have been lightning for the way it raced through my entire body. I could feel my pulse hammering in my throat, could feel heat rising in my cheeks despite the cool morning air. Then Samuel slowly pulled his hand away, and the moment was over, but its echo remained, a tremor in the air between us that spoke of things that couldn't be spoken, of wants that couldn't be named. The sun climbed higher as we continued our journey toward town. The landscape opened up into rolling hills dotted with farmhouses and barns, each one neat and orderly, each one speaking of lives lived according to principles passed down through generations. This was our world, bounded by faith and tradition, governed by rules that were clear and unbreakable, safe in its certainty about right and wrong, about the proper way for a man to live his life. And yet, sitting beside Samuel Miller in the growing warmth of the morning, I felt those boundaries blurring at the edges, felt questions stirring that I'd never allowed myself to ask. We were approaching a small bridge that crossed the creek when I dropped my glove. It slipped from my lap where I'd placed it when the sun grew warm enough to make wearing it uncomfortable, falling silently to the floor of the cart near Samuel's feet. I started to reach for it, but he was already bending down, his long frame folding gracefully as he retrieved the worn leather glove from where it had landed. He straightened slowly, holding the glove in his palm like an offering. I reached out to take it from him, my fingers extended, my heart beating so hard I was certain he could hear it. Our hands met in the space between us, my fingers brushing against his as I grasped the glove, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, we were touching. His skin was warm and slightly rough from work, calloused in places where tools had worn their familiar grooves. His fingers were longer than mine, more graceful, and when they curved slightly around mine, I felt something inside my chest break open like a flower turning toward the sun. Neither of us pulled away immediately. We sat there in the rocking cart, our hands touching over a simple leather glove, our eyes locked for the first time since we'd begun this journey. In his gaze, I saw something that matched the ache in my own chest, a longing that had no name, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied by anything the world would allow us to have. Then a bird called sharply from somewhere nearby, breaking the spell, and we both jerked back as if we'd been burned. I clutched the glove against my chest, feeling the rapid flutter of my heartbeat through my coat. Samuel turned away, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists on his thighs. The moment was over, but it had left something changed between us. The air felt charged, electric with possibility and danger in equal measure. I could barely focus on the road ahead, could barely remember why we were traveling to town in the first place. All I could think about was the warmth of his fingers against mine, the way his eyes had gone soft for just an instant before shuttering closed again. We crossed the bridge with Ruth's hooves clattering on the wooden planks, the sound echoing off the water below. The creek was clearer here, shallow enough to see the smooth stones on the bottom, the small fish that darted between patches of sunlight and shadow. On the far bank, a great blue heron stood motionless among the reeds, its long neck curved like a question mark against the sky. Samuel was watching the heron too, his face turned away from me, his profile etched against the backdrop of water and sky. The morning light caught in his dark hair, picking out strands of copper and gold I'd never noticed before. His collar had loosened during our journey, revealing a small triangle of skin at the base of his throat, and I found myself staring at that patch of exposed flesh with an intensity that made my hands shake on the reins. This was wrong. This was dangerous. This was everything I'd been taught to fear and avoid, everything that led away from the narrow path of righteousness and toward damnation. But sitting there beside him, watching the way the light played across his features, I found I couldn't bring myself to care about any of that. All I cared about was the next breath he would take, the next word he might speak, the next moment when our eyes might meet again across the small distance that separated us. The heron took flight suddenly, its great wings beating slowly as it lifted into the sky. Samuel watched it go, his head tilted back, his lips slightly parted. When he finally turned back toward the road, his eyes found mine for just an instant, and I saw something there that made my breath catch in my throat. A recognition, a shared understanding of something neither of us could say aloud. We had traveled perhaps 10 miles by the time the town came into view, its buildings rising from the landscape like a small cluster of hope and commerce. Smoke drifted from chimneys, horses and buggies moved along the main street, and people went about their morning business with the brisk efficiency of those who had important tasks to complete. I guided Ruth toward the general store where Samuel would conduct whatever business had brought him to town. The morning was fully bright now, warm enough that I could feel sweat beginning to gather beneath my coat. The mist had burned away completely, leaving the world sharp and clear, every detail visible in the clean spring light. Samuel shifted beside me as we approached the store, preparing to dismount. I could feel him gathering himself, pulling back into whatever quiet place he occupied when the world required him to speak and interact with others. The journey was ending, and with it this strange interlude of silence and awareness that had grown between us like something wild and unnamed. "I'll wait here," I said as we rolled to a stop in front of the store. It was the most words I'd spoken since we'd begun our journey, and they felt foreign on my tongue, too loud after the long quiet we'd shared. Samuel nodded and climbed down from the cart, his movements deliberate and sure. He paused for a moment beside Ruth, running his hand along her neck the way I had done earlier, and I wondered if he was delaying the moment when he would have to walk away, when the spell of the morning would be broken by the demands of ordinary life. Then he straightened his shoulders and walked toward the store, his back straight, his stride purposeful. I watched him disappear through the doorway, swallowed by the shadows inside, and suddenly felt achingly alone sitting on the cart in the brightness of the morning sun. I could see him through the store window, moving between the shelves, speaking quietly to the shopkeeper. Even from a distance, even through glass, there was something about the way he carried himself that drew my attention like iron filings to a magnet. He moved with economy and grace, wasting no motion, claiming no more space than necessary, but somehow commanding attention simply by existing. A child ran past the cart, chasing a hoop with a stick, laughing with the pure joy that only children possess. The sound should have made me smile, should have pulled me back into the ordinary world of everyday concerns, but I barely noticed. All my attention was focused on the figure moving through the store, on the way the light from the window caught the planes of his face, on the careful way he examined each item before making his selection. Another child bumped into me as she ran past, her small body colliding with my leg where it hung over the side of the cart. She looked up at me with wide eyes, perhaps expecting an apology or a gentle word, but I was so lost in watching Samuel that I didn't even register her presence. She stood there for a moment, then shrugged and ran on, her attention already caught by something else. Time seemed suspended as I sat there in the warming sun, watching and waiting. The town moved around me, women with baskets over their arms, men leading horses, children playing in the dust. But I was separate from it all, held in place by an invisible thread that connected me to the man inside the store. Finally, Samuel emerged, carrying a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. He walked back to the cart with the same measured stride, his face giving nothing away. But when he climbed up beside me, settling into his place on the wooden seat, something had changed. There was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of some internal struggle I couldn't begin to understand. I clicked to Ruth and we pulled away from the store, beginning our journey home. The sun was higher now, warm on our faces, and the day had settled into the kind of perfect spring weather that made the world seem full of promise and possibility. For the first hour of our return journey, the silence between us felt different than it had on the way to town. There was a weight to it now, a heaviness that pressed down on both of us like the air before a thunderstorm. Samuel sat rigidly beside me, his hands clenched in his lap, his gaze fixed on the road ahead with an intensity that seemed forced. I wanted to ask what had happened in the store, what had changed to make him seem so distant and closed off, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself hyper-aware of every point where our bodies came close to touching, the space between our shoulders, the gap between our thighs, the air that moved between us with each rocking motion of the cart. We passed the creek again, and the heron was back, standing in the same spot among the reeds. This time, Samuel didn't look. He kept his eyes straight ahead, his jaw set, his whole body radiating a tension that made the space between us feel electric with unspoken conflict. The road curved away from the water, leading us back through the familiar landscape of farms and fields. But something had shifted during our time in town. Some delicate balance had been disturbed, and now we were both struggling to find our footing on ground that had seemed solid just hours before. It was as we approached the grove of oak trees that Samuel finally moved. He shifted on the seat, turning slightly toward me, and I felt my breath catch in anticipation of whatever he might say. But he didn't speak. Instead, he simply moved closer, closing the gap between us by inches until his thigh pressed gently against mine. The contact sent shockwaves through my entire body. Where our legs touched, I could feel the warmth of his skin through the layers of fabric, could feel the solid reality of another person choosing to be close to me in a way that went beyond accident or necessity. My hands trembled on the reins, and I had to force myself to keep breathing, to keep Ruth moving steadily down the road. Samuel didn't pull away. If anything, he settled more firmly against me, his shoulder brushing mine with each sway of the cart. The gesture was subtle, almost casual, but it spoke volumes about the tension that had been building between us all morning, about the careful dance we'd been performing around something neither of us dared to name. We traveled like that for several miles, our bodies touching along a narrow line of contact that felt more intimate than any conversation could have been. The sun beat down on us, warming the air, and I could smell the scent of Samuel's skin, clean and masculine, with a hint of the soap his mother made from lye and lavender. The familiar landmarks of home began to appear around us. The Yoder farm, the Stoltzfus place with its line of laundry, the pasture where our own cattle grazed in the afternoon sun. With each passing mile, I felt the weight of return settling over us like a heavy cloak. Soon this journey would be over. Soon we would go back to our separate lives, to the careful distance we maintained at meetings and gatherings, to the pretense that this morning had never happened. But for now, we were still alone on the road, still connected by the warm pressure of leg against leg, still suspended in this strange pocket of time where normal rules seemed not to apply. It was Samuel who finally broke the silence. "You don't talk much," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the afternoon air. The words hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or leave standing empty. I felt the weight of his attention, felt him waiting for my response with a patience that spoke of deep reserves of stillness. "I think too much instead," I said finally, the admission coming out raw and honest in a way that surprised me. Samuel let out a soft breath, barely audible over the sound of Ruth's hooves and the creaking of the cartwheels. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter than before, intimate in a way that made my chest tighten with longing. I do that too. The simple words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. In them, I heard an acknowledgement of something shared, something that went beyond the careful politeness that governed most interactions in our small world. Here was someone else who lived inside his own head, who struggled with thoughts that couldn't be spoken aloud, who understood the weight of silence and the danger of words. We were approaching the turn that would take us to my father's farm, and I could see our house in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney where my mother was preparing the evening meal. Soon Samuel would climb down from the cart and walk away, disappearing into his own life as completely as if this morning had been nothing more than a dream. But the pressure of his leg against mine remained constant, warm and solid and real, and his words echoed in my mind like a promise. I do that too. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Long shadows stretched across the fields, and the air was filled with the soft sounds of evening, birds calling from the trees, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the gentle rustle of wind through new grass. As we turned into the lane that led to my father's farm, I felt something shift inside my chest, some door that had been locked for years creaking open just a fraction. Whatever was happening between Samuel and me, whatever had been born in the silence of our shared journey, it was real, it was dangerous, and it was only the beginning. The cart rolled to a stop in front of our house, and for a moment, neither of us moved. We sat there in the golden light of late afternoon, our bodies still touching, our breaths visible in the cooling air. The journey was over, but something else was just beginning. Samuel climbed down from the cart slowly, reluctantly, his hand trailing along the wooden seat as if he was unwilling to break the last connection between us. He stood beside Ruth for a moment, looking up at me with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the ride." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. He turned and began walking away down the lane toward his own farm, his figure growing smaller with each step. But he didn't look back, and somehow that felt like the most eloquent thing he could have done. I sat on the cart long after he had disappeared from sight, watching the road where he had walked, feeling the echo of his presence in the space beside me where the wooden seat still held the warmth of his body. The sun continued its descent, painting the world in deeper shades of gold and red, and I knew that something fundamental had changed in the course of a single morning. Father appeared in the doorway of the house, his silhouette dark against the lamplight inside. He raised his hand in a brief gesture, and I clicked to Ruth, guiding her toward the barn where she would be fed and watered and settled for the night. As I went through the familiar motions of unharnessing the cart and caring for the horse, I found myself replaying every moment of the journey, the weight of silence between us, the electricity of almost touches, the way Samuel's voice had sounded when he said those final words. I do that too. Tomorrow I would wake in my narrow bed in the room under the eaves, and life would continue as it always had. There would be chores and prayers and meals eaten in comfortable silence. There would be Sunday meetings where Samuel and I would nod politely to each other and maintain the careful distance that propriety required. But something had changed, something that couldn't be unchanged no matter how much time passed or how carefully we guarded our secrets. In the space between departure and return, in the long, quiet miles of a spring morning, something had taken root that would grow whether we tended it or not. The road stretched out behind us, empty now in the gathering dusk, but it would always be there, waiting to carry us wherever we might choose to go. Part 2, the days that followed our journey to town moved like water over stone, slow, persistent, wearing away at something I couldn't name. I went through the familiar rhythms of farm life with hands that remembered their work, but a mind that wandered down dusty roads, chasing shadows and half-remembered touches. Mother noticed my distraction first. At breakfast on the third morning after the cart ride, she set down her coffee cup with more force than necessary and fixed me with the kind of look that could see straight through to the marrow of a person's bones. "You're somewhere else entirely," she said. her voice carrying the gentle reproach of someone who had birthed me and therefore claimed the right to know my troubles. I looked up from the eggs growing cold on my plate, scrambling for words that would satisfy without revealing. "Just thinking about spring planting," I said. "All the work ahead." Father grunted his approval from behind his newspaper, but Mother's eyes remained fixed on my face, searching for the truth that lived in the spaces between my words. She was a woman who understood the weight of unspoken things, who had built a marriage on the careful architecture of what could be said and what must remain hidden. "Thinking too much never planted a single seed," she said finally, but her tone had softened. She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly, her fingers warm and work-worn against my skin. "Sometimes the best thing is to keep your hands busy and let your mind follow." I nodded and forced myself to eat, tasting nothing but ash and longing. Outside the window, the world was waking up to another day of certainty and purpose, but inside my chest, something restless prowled like a caged animal, pacing the boundaries of everything I'd been taught to believe about the proper shape of a man's desires. That afternoon, word came that Jonas Miller needed help repairing his barn roof after the late winter storms had loosened several boards. It was the kind of community obligation that required no discussion. When a neighbor needed help, you provided it, as naturally as breathing or praying or rising with the sun. Father and I loaded our tools into the cart, the same cart where Samuel and I had sat in silence just days before. As Ruth pulled us down the familiar roads, I found myself watching for signs of him, a figure in a distant field, a shadow moving between buildings, any indication that he was real and not just a fever dream born of loneliness and spring longing. The Miller farm appeared around a bend in the road, its buildings neat and prosperous in the afternoon light. Several other carts were already there, and I could see men moving purposefully around the barn, their voices carrying across the yard in the easy camaraderie of shared work. And there he was. Samuel stood near the barn door, holding one end of a long wooden beam while another man examined its length for flaws. The afternoon sun caught in his dark hair, and his sleeves were rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by old scars, testament to years of hard work and small accidents that came with a life lived close to tools and animals and weather. He looked up as our cart approached, his eyes finding mine across the distance with an accuracy that suggested he'd been watching for us. For me. The recognition that passed between us was swift and electric, there and gone before anyone else could notice, but it left me feeling exposed and strangely breathless. Father climbed down from the cart and went immediately to speak with Jonas Miller about the work that needed doing. I followed more slowly, gathering tools and trying to compose my face into an expression of ordinary neighborly concern. But all my attention was focused on Samuel, on the way he moved through the group of men like he belonged completely to their world while somehow remaining apart from it. "Samuel," Jonas called out, "take young Eli and help bring the rest of those boards from the woodshed. We'll need them before the afternoon's over." My name in his father's mouth, paired with Samuel's, felt like prophecy and doom combined. Samuel nodded once and set down the beam he'd been holding, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. When he looked at me, his expression was carefully neutral, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of awareness that matched the sudden acceleration of my pulse. "Come on," he said quietly, and I fell into step beside him as we walked toward the woodshed. The late afternoon air was warm and still, heavy with the scent of new grass and the distant promise of rain. Our footsteps matched naturally, and I found myself acutely aware of the space between our bodies, the way his shoulder would brush mine if either of us moved just slightly to the left. The woodshed stood at the edge of the Miller property, its door hanging open to reveal stacks of lumber waiting to be claimed for repairs and building projects. Samuel stepped inside first, disappearing into the shadowed interior, and I followed, blinking as my eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. We worked in silence, selecting boards and carrying them out to stack near the barn. The wood was heavy and rough, still fragrant with the smell of the trees it had once been. Each trip required us to coordinate our movements, lifting together, walking in sync, setting down our burden with shared timing. It was on the fourth trip that it happened. We were carrying a particularly long beam, one that required both of us to grip it at multiple points to keep it balanced. Samuel walked backward, guiding our path while I supported the rear end, trusting him to see where we were going. The beam was awkward and unwieldy, and as we maneuvered it around a pile of sawhorses, we both had to adjust our grip. My hand slid along the rough wood, searching for better purchase, and suddenly my fingers were covering his where they wrapped around the beam. The contact was firm and undeniable. Skin against skin, palm against palm, our hands layered together around the same piece of timber. Neither of us let go immediately. For a moment that stretched like taffy in the afternoon heat, we stood frozen in place, the beam suspended between us, our hands joined in the kind of accidental intimacy that should have been meaningless but felt instead like the most significant thing that had ever happened to me. I could feel the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his fingers, the slight tremor that ran through his hand and into mine. His eyes found mine over the length of wood between us, and in them I saw my own confusion and longing reflected back at me. Whatever was happening here, whatever invisible current was running between us, he felt it too. The knowledge was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Then someone called out from the barn, "Where are those boards?" And the spell was broken. We both pulled our hands away at the same moment, the sudden absence of contact leaving my fingers feeling cold and empty. We finished carrying the beam to its destination without speaking, but the echo of that shared touch lingered between us like heat shimmers rising from summer pavement. The work continued through the afternoon, boards replaced and nails driven home with the steady rhythm of men who understood the satisfaction of tasks completed and problem solved. But I moved through it all in a daze, my attention split between the demands of the moment and the memory of Samuel's hand beneath mine, warm and solid and real. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the work was declared finished. The men gathered in the yard to admire their handiwork and share the kind of easy conversation that came with the completion of community obligation. Jonas Miller's wife appeared with jugs of cold cider and plates of cookies, and for a while the late afternoon took on the comfortable rhythm of neighbors enjoying each other's company. I found myself standing apart from the main group, leaning against a fence post and watching the easy interactions around me. Samuel was nearby, close enough that I could have reached out and touched his arm, but he might as well have been on the other side of the county for all the distance that propriety demanded we maintain. As the gathering began to break up and men started loading their tools back into carts, Samuel moved closer to where I stood. He didn't speak, but his presence beside me felt deliberate and charged with meaning. We watched the other men preparing to leave, watched the shadows growing longer across the Miller farm, watched the first bats begin their evening hunt in the deepening sky. "Storm coming," he said finally, his voice so quiet I almost missed it over the sounds of departure around us. I looked up at the western sky where clouds were indeed gathering in dark masses that promised rain before morning. But I had the sense that he was talking about something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the electricity that sparked between us whenever we shared the same space. "Yes," I said, and the word carried more weight than such a simple agreement should have borne. Father appeared at my elbow, ready to head home before the storm arrived. I gathered my tools and followed him to our cart, but not before catching one last glimpse of Samuel standing by the fence, his figure already softened by the approaching dusk. He raised his hand in farewell, a gesture so brief it might have been imagined, and I carried the image of it with me all the way home. The storm arrived just after midnight, announcing itself with rumbles of thunder that rolled across the countryside like the voice of God calling the faithful to account. I lay in my narrow bed under the eaves and listened to the rain lashing against the windows, feeling each flash of lightning illuminate the familiar contours of my room in stark, momentary clarity. But it wasn't the storm that kept me awake. It was the memory of Samuel's hand beneath mine, the way his eyes had looked when he'd said storm coming, the growing certainty that something was building between us that would be harder to weather than any mere atmospheric disturbance. The rain continued through the next day, keeping everyone inside and turning the roads into muddy ribbons that would be impassable until the sun returned to dry them. I spent the morning helping Mother with indoor chores, my hands busy with mending and cleaning while my mind wandered down paths that led nowhere safe or sanctioned. By afternoon, the worst of the storm had passed, though rain still fell in intermittent showers that made the world smell green and fresh and full of possibility. I was in the barn checking on the animals and making sure no damage had been done by the wind when I heard footsteps in the doorway behind me. I turned, expecting to see Father or one of the hired men, but instead found Samuel standing just inside the barn door, his coat dark with rain and his hat pulled low over his eyes. Water dripped from the brim in a steady rhythm that seemed to count the seconds of my surprise. "Came to check if you lost any shingles," he said, his voice carrying easily across the space between us. "Saw a few loose ones from the road." It was a reasonable explanation, the kind of neighborly concern that would excuse his presence here without raising questions. But the way he stood in the doorway, the way his eyes found mine and held them, suggested that loose shingles were not the only reason for his visit. "We're fine," I said, though my voice came out rougher than I'd intended. "Nothing that can't be fixed." He nodded and stepped further into the barn, letting the door swing closed behind him. The sound of rain on the roof was louder here, a constant percussion that seemed to isolate us from the rest of the world. In the dim light filtering through the windows, his face was all planes and shadows, beautiful and unknowable. "Good," he said, but he made no move to leave. Instead, he walked slowly along the row of stalls, running his hand along the wooden rails in a gesture that seemed unconscious but purposeful. Strange weather for this time of year. "Everything's strange lately," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He paused in his slow circuit of the barn and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. In the silence that followed, the rain seemed to grow louder, more insistent, as if the storm itself was trying to fill the space between us with sound. "Sometimes I wonder," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the drumming on the roof, "what silence would say if it had a voice." The words hung in the air like notes from a song I'd never heard but somehow recognized. They spoke to something deep in my chest, something that had been aching without a name for longer than I could remember. I stared at him, trying to understand what he was really asking, what he was really offering in the careful construction of that sentence. I wanted to answer, wanted to find words that would match the poetry of what he'd just given me. But all I could do was nod, a single movement of my head that somehow felt like the most honest response I'd ever made to anything. Samuel watched me nod, and something in his expression shifted, softened perhaps, or maybe just grew more certain. He looked around the barn once more, taking in the familiar sights of hay bales and farm tools and animals waiting patiently for the storm to pass. "Well," he said, moving back toward the door, "looks like everything's secure here." He paused with his hand on the door handle, looking back at me one more time. "Take care of yourself, Eli," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke my name that made it sound like a promise or a prayer. Then he was gone, back out into the rain, leaving me alone with the sound of water on the roof and the echo of his words reverberating through my mind. Sometimes I wonder what silence would say if it had a voice. I stood there long after he'd left, turning the phrase over and over like a stone worn smooth by handling. What would silence say? What truths lived in the spaces between words, in the pauses that stretched like bridges over chasms too wide for ordinary language to cross? That night I lay in bed listening to the last drops of rain tap against my window, and I found myself whispering his words into the darkness. Sometimes I wonder what silence would say if it had a voice. Each repetition seemed to unlock something new, some hidden meaning that revealed itself only in the careful consideration of quiet moments. The days that followed fell into a pattern that felt both accidental and inevitable. I would be working in a field, and Samuel would appear on the road, walking from one task to another. Our eyes would meet across the distance, and we would nod, polite, proper, giving no outward sign of the recognition that passed between us like electricity through water. Or I would be in town on an errand, and I would see him emerge from the blacksmith shop, his face serious with concentration as he examined a tool or piece of hardware. He would sense my presence and look up, and for a moment the busy street around us would fade until there was nothing but the space between us and the careful way we pretended not to notice each other's presence. These encounters began to feel less like coincidence and more like a dance we were learning together, a slow orbit that brought us into each other's sphere with increasing frequency but never allowed us to come close enough to touch. We were planets governed by some invisible force, drawn together by gravity but held apart by the vast emptiness of everything we couldn't say. The awareness of him became a constant hum beneath the surface of my daily life. I would be helping Father repair a fence, and my hands would remember the feeling of Samuel's fingers beneath mine on that wooden beam. I would be sitting in church, listening to the preacher's words about righteousness and the narrow path, and I would find myself searching the congregation for the back of Samuel's head, for the familiar line of his shoulders beneath his Sunday coat. It was during the preparation for a barn raising at the Stoltzfus farm that the pattern shifted, becoming something more deliberate and dangerous. The work began at dawn on a Thursday morning that promised to be warm and clear. Men arrived from all over the district, bringing tools and expertise and the kind of communal energy that could raise a building from foundation to roof peak in a single day. I came with Father, our cart loaded with the specialized tools he'd collected over decades of similar projects. Samuel was already there when we arrived, standing with a group of men near the foundation stones, his head bent over architectural drawings that showed where each beam and board would find its place. He looked up as our cart approached, and I felt the familiar jolt of recognition pass between us, swift and electric and immediately suppressed. The work began with the systematic precision that marked all such community efforts. Posts were raised and braced, beams were fitted into place, and the skeleton of the barn began to take shape under the coordinated effort of 30 men working toward a common goal. I found myself assigned to the crew responsible for installing the roof supports, work that required careful coordination and a good head for heights. Samuel was on the same crew, and as the morning progressed, we fell into the natural rhythm of men who understood each other's capabilities without needing to discuss them. We worked mostly in silence, our communication limited to the practical necessities of shared labor. Hand me that mallet. Watch the end of this beam, ready to lift on 3. But beneath the ordinary give and take of construction work, I was acutely aware of his presence beside me, of the way our movements began to synchronize as if we were dancers learning the same steps. By midday, the sun was high and hot, and most of the men had stripped down to their shirt sleeves, their faces flushed with exertion and on a sweat. Samuel's shirt had come untucked from his pants, and I caught glimpses of skin at his waist when he stretched to reach a high beam or bent to pick up a dropped tool. Each flash of flesh seemed to burn itself into my memory, adding to the catalog of images I carried with me in the quiet hours when sleep refused to come. The afternoon brought the most challenging part of the work, setting the massive ridge beam that would form the spine of the roof. It required the coordinated effort of every man present, and even then it was a delicate operation that demanded perfect timing and absolute trust in the abilities of your neighbors. Samuel and I found ourselves positioned at the same lifting point, our hands gripping the same section of beam as we waited for the signal to raise it into place. The wood was rough and heavy, still fragrant with the smell of the oak tree it had once been, and I could feel the grain of it beneath my palms as we prepared for the lift. "On 3, called out the crew leader. 1, 2, 3. We lifted together, 30 men moving as one, the massive beam rising slowly toward its appointed place in the structure. But as we adjusted our grips and shifted our positions to guide the beam into the brackets that would hold it, Samuel's hand landed directly over mine on the wood. This time there could be no pretending it was accidental. His palm pressed firmly against the back of my hand, his fingers curving around mine where they gripped the beam. The contact was warm and deliberate and utterly unmistakable, and when I looked up to meet his eyes, I saw my own awareness reflected there. For the space of 3 heartbeats, we stood like that, hands layered together, the weight of the beam supported by our combined strength, our eyes locked across a distance that might as well have been an ocean for all the impossibility it contained. Around us, the other men continued their work, focused on the task at hand, unaware of the small revolution taking place in their midst. Then the beam settled into place with a satisfying thunk, and the moment was over. Samuel's hand slipped away from mine as naturally as if it had never been there, and we both stepped back to admire the progress that had been made. But the echo of his touch remained, warm and electric against my skin, a sensation I knew I would carry with me long after the barn was finished and the work crews had dispersed. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of activity and accomplishment. By evening, the barn stood complete, walls raised, roof shingled, doors hung on their hinges. It was a testament to what could be achieved when people worked together toward a common purpose, when individual effort was subsumed into something larger and more lasting. As the sun began to set, painting the new barn in shades of gold and amber, the men gathered in the yard to share the meal that had been prepared by the women of the community. Tables groaned under the weight of fried chicken and fresh bread, pickled vegetables, and fruit pies that spoke of abundance and generosity. I filled my plate and found a place to sit on a hay bale at the edge of the gathering, content to observe the easy camaraderie around me while my mind processed the events of the day. The conversation flowed like water, touching on weather and crops, livestock prices, and the prospects for the coming harvest. Samuel appeared beside me, as if he'd been drawn by the same invisible force that seemed to govern our interactions. He settled onto the hay bale next to mine, close enough that I could smell the clean scent of his sweat mixed with sawdust and the lingering fragrance of oak wood. "Good work today," he said quietly, his words meant for me alone. "Yes," I agreed, though I was thinking less about the barn that now stood complete in the gathering dusk and more about the moments when our hands had touched, when the careful distance we maintained had collapsed into something more honest and more dangerous. We ate in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Around us, the celebration continued, but we seemed to exist in our own small pocket of quiet, separate from the larger gathering while still being part of it. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, people started to gather their things and make their way home. Another successful barn raising had been completed. Another neighbor's need had been met. Another testament to community cooperation had been raised against the sky. But as I loaded our tools into Father's cart and prepared for the journey home, I carried with me something more precious than the satisfaction of work well done. I carried the memory of Samuel's hand over mine, the weight of his palm pressing my fingers against rough oak wood, the certainty that whatever was building between us was growing stronger with each passing day. The pattern continued through the following weeks, these careful encounters that felt both accidental and orchestrated by some force beyond our control. I would be walking to check on cattle in a distant pasture, and I would see him crossing the same field on his way to repair a fence. Our paths would intersect for just a moment, long enough for a nod and perhaps a word about the weather before we continued on our separate ways. Or I would be sitting on our front porch in the evening, watching the sunset behind the hills, and I would see him walking along the road that ran past our farm. He would slow his pace as he passed, and sometimes he would raise his hand in greeting, and I would feel something loosen in my chest at this small acknowledgement of my existence. These moments began to feel like a lifeline, small doses of connection that sustained me through the long hours of ordinary life. I found myself planning my days around the possibility of encountering him, choosing routes and timing tasks in ways that might increase the chances of our paths crossing. And I wasn't the only one. I began to notice that Samuel seemed to appear in places where I was likely to be, that his errands took him past locations where I was working, that his evening walks seemed to coincide with the times when I was most likely to be outside. The realization that he might be seeking these encounters as deliberately as I was both thrilled and terrified me. It was on a warm evening in late spring that the delicate balance of our careful dance finally shifted into something more direct. I had finished the evening chores and was walking the fence line that bordered our property, checking for damage from the recent storms and enjoying the peace that came with the end of a long day. The sun was setting behind me, painting long shadows across the pasture, and the air was soft with the promise of true summer warmth. I was approaching the corner where our fence met the road when I saw him, a solitary figure sitting on the wooden rail, his legs dangling over the side, his face turned toward the western sky. Samuel had chosen the exact spot where I ended my evening walks, the place where I often paused to watch the sun disappear behind the hills. My first instinct was to turn back, to respect the privacy of whatever contemplation had brought him to this quiet place. But something in his posture, the way his shoulders curved inward, the tilt of his head as he watched the dying light, suggested that he was waiting for something or someone. I continued walking toward him, my footsteps loud in the evening quiet. He turned at the sound, and when he saw me approaching, something in his expression shifted from solitude to welcome. He didn't speak, but he shifted over on the fence rail, making space beside him with a gesture so subtle it might have been unconscious. I climbed up beside him without a word, settling myself on the wooden rail with careful attention to the distance between our bodies. Close enough to feel his presence, far enough apart to maintain the pretense that this was nothing more than two neighbors sharing a sunset. For a long time we sat in silence, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. The sky grew painted in shades of orange and pink, and the first fireflies began to blink in the grass around us. The evening was soft and peaceful, full of the sounds of a world settling into rest, cattle lowing in distant fields, birds calling from the trees, the gentle whisper of wind through new leaves. But beneath the tranquil surface, I was acutely aware of Samuel beside me, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the careful way we both held ourselves to avoid accidental contact. The space between us felt charged with possibility and prohibition in equal measure. A firefly blinked near my feet, then another, and soon the gathering darkness was filled with tiny points of light dancing through the air like earthbound stars. I watched them with the fascination that never seemed to fade, no matter how many summer evenings I'd witnessed this same magic. "I used to try to catch them when I was small," Samuel said quietly, his voice barely disturbing the peace around us. "Thought if I could gather enough of them in a jar, I could make my own lantern." "Did it work?" I asked, though I knew the answer from my own childhood experiments with the same impossible dream. "For a while," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, "until I realized they only shine when they're free." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning that went far beyond childhood memories of captured fireflies. I felt them settle into my chest like seeds waiting for the right conditions to grow into something larger and more dangerous than either of us was prepared to handle. We watched the light show continue around us, dozens of fireflies blinking in and out of existence like thoughts too fragile to survive direct examination. The sun disappeared behind the hills, leaving the sky painted in deepening shades of purple and gold. "I should head home," I said finally, though every part of me wanted to remain on that fence rail forever, suspended between day and night, between the known world and whatever lay beyond the boundaries of everything I'd been taught to want. "Yes," Samuel agreed, but neither of us moved. We sat for another few minutes, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Then, as if by mutual agreement, we climbed down from the fence and stood facing each other in the gathering darkness. "Good night, Eli," he said. And again there was something in the way he spoke my name that made it sound like more than simple farewell. "Good night," I replied, and we walked away in opposite directions, each disappearing into the darkness that would carry us safely home. But as I made my way back to the house, I carried with me the memory of sitting beside him in the soft evening air, of sharing silence that felt more intimate than any conversation could have been. And I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me, that we were moving towards something that could no longer be contained within the careful boundaries of neighborly politeness. Word came the following week that supplies needed to be fetched from town, lumber for repairs, hardware that couldn't be found locally, provisions that required the kind of trip that took most of a day to complete. Father mentioned it at breakfast on Tuesday morning, his tone suggesting that he was thinking through the logistics of who could be spared for such an errand. "Samuel Miller's going as well," he said, buttering his bread with careful attention. "His father asked if we might share the cart, make the most of the journey." My heart leapt at the words, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. Another journey with Samuel, another opportunity to sit beside him in the rocking cart, another chance to exist in that strange space between ordinary life and whatever was growing between us in the silence. "I can take the cart," I offered, trying to sound casual about what felt like the most important opportunity of my life. Father nodded his approval, and the matter was settled. Thursday morning would find Samuel and me once again sharing the wooden seat of our cart, traveling the familiar roads toward town with whatever cargo of unspoken longing we carried between us. The days leading up to Thursday passed with agonizing slowness. I went through the motions of daily life, but my attention was fixed on the approaching journey, on the possibility it represented, on the fear and excitement that warred in my chest whenever I thought about sitting beside Samuel for hours of unguarded time. Thursday morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of warmth to come. I was up before sunrise, checking the harness and making sure the cart was ready for the journey ahead. Ruth seemed to sense the importance of the day, standing patiently while I fussed over details that didn't really need my attention. Samuel arrived just as the sun was clearing the eastern hills, walking up the lane with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder and something wrapped in brown paper tucked under his arm. He looked rested and purposeful, but I caught something in his eyes, a flicker of the same nervous energy that had been keeping me awake at night. "Morning," he said as he approached the cart. "Morning," I replied, and we looked at each other for a moment that stretched longer than simple greeting required. Then he climbed up onto the cart seat, and I followed. And suddenly we were sitting beside each other again, our bodies separated by inches and an ocean of everything we couldn't say. But this time, something was different. This time there was an expectation in the air, a sense that the careful distance we'd been maintaining was about to be tested. Samuel reached into his bag and pulled out a folded blanket, thick wool, well-worn but clean, the kind of thing that spoke of practical comfort rather than luxury. Without a word, he unfolded it and laid it across the wooden seat between us, smoothing it with careful hands. The gesture was simple and practical, a cushion against the hard wood, protection from splinters, comfort for what would be a long day of travel. But it felt like something more significant, some small but meaningful change in the careful choreography of our interactions. "Long day ahead," he said by way of explanation, though his eyes didn't quite meet mine as he spoke. "Yes," I agreed, and clicked to Ruth to begin our journey. We rolled away from the farm in the early morning light, the familiar rhythm of hooves and wheels marking time as we made our way toward town. But from the very beginning, this journey felt different from our first shared trip. The blanket beneath us created a sense of shared space, of deliberate comfort, that spoke to an intimacy that hadn't existed before. The silence between us was different too, not awkward or charged with tension, but comfortable in a way that suggested we were both settling into something that felt increasingly natural. Our bodies swayed with the motion of the cart, and I found myself acutely aware of every point where the blanket connected us, every moment when the rocking motion brought us fractionally closer together. The sun climbed higher as we traveled, warming the air and painting the landscape in the bright colors of late spring. Fields stretched out on either side of the road, green with new growth and dotted with grazing cattle. The world was fully awake now, busy with the urgent business of growing and becoming, and we were part of it, two figures in a cart traveling together toward whatever destination awaited us. Miles passed beneath Ruth's steady hooves. We exchanged occasional words about the weather, about landmarks we passed, about practical matters related to our errands in town, but mostly we traveled in the kind of companionable silence that spoke to a growing ease with each other's presence. It was as we approached the grove of oak trees where we'd shared that moment of recognition on our first journey together that Samuel finally spoke about something more substantial than the state of the roads. "Been thinking about what I said," he said quietly, his voice almost lost beneath the sound of the cartwheels, "about silence having a voice." I turned to look at him, surprised by the reference to our conversation in the barn during the rainstorm. His profile was serious against the backdrop of green trees, his jaw set in the way that suggested he was working up the courage to say something important. "What about it?" I asked, though my heart was already beating faster in anticipation of his answer. "Been wondering if maybe it's not about what silence would say," he continued, his hands folded carefully in his lap. "Maybe it's about what we're afraid to hear." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs with their accuracy. Here was the thing we'd been dancing around for weeks, the truth that lived in the space between our careful politeness and the electricity that sparked whenever we shared the same air. I wanted to respond, wanted to acknowledge the courage it had taken for him to voice what we'd both been thinking. But before I could find the words, we were entering the grove. and the familiar shade of the oak trees closed around us like a benediction. The road narrowed here, forcing Ruth to slow her pace as we navigated between the massive trunks that had stood sentinel over this path for longer than either of us had been alive. The cart rocked gently from side to side, and I could hear Ruth's breathing grow heavier as she adjusted to the change in terrain. And then, as if the trees themselves had been waiting for this moment, the cart came to a complete stop. Ruth stood quietly in the harness, her sides heaving slightly from the exertion of the morning's travel. Around us, the grove was filled with the soft sounds of a forest in full leaf, birds calling from the branches above, the whisper of wind through new leaves, the distant sound of water running over stones. In the sudden stillness, the space between Samuel and me seemed to contract until we were breathing the same air, sharing the same small pocket of existence beneath the canopy of oak leaves. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the clean scent of his skin mixed with the earthy fragrance of the woods around us. Something had shifted in the quality of the silence between us. It no longer felt careful or guarded, but instead carried a weight of possibility that made my hands tremble on the reins. This was the moment we'd been building toward through all our careful encounters, all our shared glances and accidental touches. It wasn't just silence, I said finally, the words coming out barely above a whisper but carrying all the weight of everything I'd been unable to say for weeks. Samuel turned to face me fully, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me feel exposed and known in ways I'd never experienced before. In his gaze, I saw my own longing reflected back at me, my own fear and desire and desperate hope that we might find a way to name what was growing between us. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It wasn't." We sat like that for a long moment, the cart motionless beneath us, our eyes locked across the small distance that separated us on one